he accidentally discovered that the flight path of the plane was a little abnormal, which meant he had to return as soon as possible. But it was too late. The flock of birds instantly destroyed the engines on both wings. The loud explosion also made the captain realize the plane had been severely damaged. Today, I recommend a highly rated masterpiece, Sully, which is being shown on a film and television platform established on .com and .top domains. Let's watch it together. Even the hundreds of passengers in the cabin were awakened by the violent vibration. The flight attendant immediately stood up, explaining that it was just a normal phenomenon of stable flow. But she didn't know the cockpit was already in chaos. The data on the dashboard had begun to malfunction. Both engines were damaged. Sully knew clearly every action he took now directly determined the fate of the lives of 155 passengers. Even with 40 years of flying experience, he was still nervous and dare not relax in the slightest. But under extreme tension, a picture of the plane crashing into a building. The image of the plane crashing into a building. At that time, it wouldn't be as simple as the death of 155 passengers. The tragedy of September 11th must not be repeated. Under great pressure, the fear that came from his heart, he began to use his experience to make the most correct judgment. Until the lights in the cabin were restored, the 155 passengers breathed a sigh of relief. However, they were unaware that this was just the beginning of a nightmare. Sully quickly took over the control of the plane and started to operate manually, which could reduce the chance of a crash. Then, he contacted the airport tower immediately and informed them that both engines on both wings were damaged. Hearing the news, the staff immediately notified the airport patrol. Clear a runway for it to land. There were hundreds of passengers on the plane. Once it crashed, the consequences would be unimaginable. Fortunately, the plane had just taken off. Sully still had plenty of control space, which was enough for him to deal with the next crisis. With the help of the airport staff, he was ready to try landing at LaGuardia Airport. Without both engines, the plane would lose its thrust. Seeing that the plane was getting closer to the ground, Sully made a bold decision. He made a bold decision. On the Hudson River near the city, he can only control the direction of the plane now, gliding at such a height. There was not enough time to turn around and return. I'm afraid that before reaching the airport, the plane would crash into the city. But this decision made in a hurry was blocked by the tower. Forced water landing is full of unknowns. Is an extreme adventure full of unknowns. And historically, there are almost no large civil airliners landing on water, with all passengers surviving. Most of the passenger planes eventually experience structural failure, eventually resulting in massive casualties. Fortunately, there is a nearby airport. There was a relatively close airport. The tower staff immediately contacted the other side and asked them to be ready for landing. But would things really go so smoothly? Register .com and .top domain names to win at the starting line and secure a bright future. Even though there was still a distance to the ground, but to glide all the way to Teterboro Airport, it was even harder. However, now we have to try. Just as Sully was about to agree with the tower staff, the plane suddenly beeped. There was an obstacle ahead, and after the sliding just now, Sully, based on his 40 years of flying experience, the altitude was not enough to reach the airport, but it was just a visual inspection. He hesitated whether to follow the tower staff's plan. To take a risk and try it. What if it could safely reach the destination? Looking at the screen, the reminder that the plane was too low to the ground, Sully's eyes flashed with determination. Then he picked up the walkie-talkie and asked the flight attendants in the cabin to prepare for landing. So the staff and passengers who received the message began to bury their heads behind the seats. This is the standard posture for emergency impact. Everyone was so scared that their breathing slowed down. Immediately, Sully also prepared for a water landing. He didn't know his own decision whether it could save the safety of 155 passengers. If he forced a turn to the airport, it will be a near-death experience. Sully controlled the direction of the plane and headed towards the Hudson River. The plane was less than 100 meters from the ground. However, Sully felt an unprecedented calm. It was the sense of security brought by his 40 years of flying. At this time on the radio, the voices of the tower staff were still echoing. The airport was about 7 miles away from them. Sully ignored it. He believed his judgment was the best choice at the moment. When the plane descended to the Hudson River, only 20 meters above the Hudson River, the final moment of forced landing had come. Sully held the control lever without a tremor. But it was his calmness also gave passengers hope to survive. Build a website with a .com or .top domain name to showcase your company's strength. Fortunately, the plane landed in an insertion way, without causing a tragic dispersal of the plane. After a long distance the plane finally docked safely on the water. From a distance, it looked like an ant standing still. But the crisis is not over now. The river is slowly swallowing the steel giant. If they don't escape in time, it won't be long before everyone will die here. Sully also realized the seriousness of the situation, so he followed the staff to evacuate the crowd. Soon, All the passengers stood on the wings on both sides, but Sully, despite his physical exhaustion, and checked the cabin for any passengers left behind. It was already winter, and the temperature of the river was close to zero, being soaked in it for a long time, which was harmful to the human body. Fortunately, under the urging of the staff, he was the last one to appear on the life raft. Half an hour later, a cruise ship also arrived and began to rescue the survivors. After official statistics, 155 passengers were unscathed. All kinds of news were overwhelming. Were reporting the miracle that one person saved hundreds of families. But just as the people were immersed in joy, and the survivors were also glad to survive, however, the most unhappy person appeared: the airlines and insurance companies. Because someone must be held responsible for the tragedy, and they must pay for the loss of the air crash. The entire plane was soaked in the Hudson River, rotting and smelling bad. Even if salvaged, it was not worth repairing. So Sully became the scapegoat. They entrusted the National Security Council to investigate and interrogate the cause of the disaster. The person in charge questioned Sully why he didn't try to return to LaGuardia Airport. Facing such a low-level question, Sully felt speechless, but he answered truthfully because there was not enough altitude to taxi the plane to the target location, and the Hudson River below was long enough and flat enough, so he chose to land on the water. If he tried to turn around and return, it would cut off all the way back. Choosing to return to the airport at that time, it would undoubtedly be a suicidal act. But the committee raised another question. How did Sully calculate that the plane's altitude was not enough to return to the airport?
There was no time for calculating. I had to rely on my experience in managing the altitude and speed of thousands of flights over 4 decades.
You're saying you didn't do any...
I eyeballed it.
The head of the committee sneered. Compared to human guesses, he preferred the simulation calculation of the aeronautical engineer. After computer data comparison, the plane had enough gliding power to reach the airport runway. But Sully said the engineers were not there. There were only a bunch of invisible data. But the committee said that these were based on the temperature, humidity, and the weight of the plane and other factors, and after countless comparisons, to come up with the current result. After that, both sides held different opinions. Neither side was convinced, but the committee did not intend to let Sully go. From whether he drank and took drugs that day, to whether there were recent family problems and caused bad mood, they wanted to find out whether it was because of Sully's operation that led to the current outcome. The committee even dropped a bombshell. After analyzing the signals from the flight data recorder, Roy's engine during the flight was always rotating. Once this possibility is confirmed, Sully would directly go from a hero to a hated public figure, because it means that the plane had enough power to land safely. But he chose the most dangerous water landing. To prove his judgment was correct, he wanted to verify the parameters simulated by the computer. Comparing with the current situation, it shows that his operation was really a misjudgment. At this moment, Sully also fell into deep self-doubt. Now it's not whether he can continue in this industry question anymore. Once confirmed, the water landing was a wrong decision. His family and career will be hit unprecedentedly. Without sleep, Sully stayed up all night in self-questioning until dawn. He came to the hearing under great pressure. There were a large number of inspectors and the media. It was like a trial. This was undoubtedly fatal for Sully. He saved 155 passengers. He seemed to have committed an unforgivable sin. The simulation experiment soon began. A huge spherical machine appeared on the screen, with 2 staff inside, representing Sully and the co-pilot respectively. Then, the scene of a flock of birds hitting the plane was simulated. When both engines on the wings were damaged, they turned around and headed back without hesitation, watching the 2 people on the screen. Simulating the situation at that time, Sully remained silent. He quietly watched their performance. In the limited time, the 2 successfully controlled the plane and landed on runway 13 at LaGuardia Airport. Next, the committee conducted a simulation flight at Teterboro Airport. The result was exactly the same as before. Both times the plane was hit and landed safely within the limited time. Landed safely at the target location. This result immediately put Sully's situation in jeopardy, and the committee's mouth curved into a smile and seemed to have a winning attitude. However, Sully reminded everyone to wake up, because this simulation experiment was a failure. It didn't take human factors into consideration at all. The 2 staff involved, as if they had received the news that the plane was going to crash. After the bird strike, they immediately returned to the airport. Without the slightest hesitation, they knew what had gone wrong and which direction they were flying. They didn't even report to the tower. They had already flown towards the 13th runway of the airport. If there was a plane taking off, 2 nearly 100-ton steel beasts collide together, what kind of scene would that be? So this simulation experiment is not practical at all. However, the committee still refused to give up. After considering Sully's appeal, they added 35 seconds. They added 35 seconds of reaction time, even though this time was not enough to handle what happened after the plane malfunction. But Sully allowed them to continue waiting. With the 35 seconds added, the two resumed the plane's forced landing. In the airport simulation, the scene was extremely quiet at this time. For fear of missing any details, everyone stared at the screen intently, for fear of missing any details. However, the result of this simulation were very different from the previous two. The plane crashed 5 miles from the airport, crashed and hit a building. He finally got her innocence back. The movie ends here.